The air in the Kolyma is not merely cold. It is a physical weight, a heavy blue pressure that sits upon the chest and slows the pulse to a rhythmic, steady crawl. Outside the small timber outpost, the world is a study in shadow and grain, a landscape drawn in the muted, dusty strokes of a dark pastel pencil against a charcoal sky. The blue is deep, almost black, layered with soft cross-hatching of indigo and slate, where the wind has carved grooves into the frozen drifts. There is no horizon, only a fading of dark gray into a darker gray, a seamless transition from the iron-hard earth to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of a Siberian winter. Inside the outpost, the light is different. It is a small, flickering circle of ochre and amber, cast by a single kerosene lamp that sits on a desk of rough-hewn larch. The light does not reach the corners of the room. It clings to the lamp glass, illuminating the fine, oily dust that dances in the rising heat, and it casts long, trembling shadows of the window frame against the opposite wall. The wood of the walls is ancient, the logs notched together with a precision that has long since succumbed to the slow, relentless expansion of ice. In the cracks between the logs, the moss is frozen solid, a brittle gray-green line that marks the boundary between the relative warmth of the room and the absolute, devouring cold of the night. The officer sits at the desk, his movements so slow they are almost imperceptible. He wears a heavy coat of thick, coarse wool, a garment that feels like a leaden blanket draped over his shoulders. The wool is a dull, faded gray, the texture rough and uneven, reminiscent of a vintage pencil drawing where the paper's tooth shows through the pigment. His hands, resting on the surface of the desk, are large and calloused, the skin etched with fine lines like the bark of a birch tree. He does not move them. He simply waits. The stillness in the room is absolute, save for the low, guttural moan of the wind as it brushes against the eaves. It is a sound that has no beginning and no end, a continuous, resonant hum that vibrates in the marrow of the bones. The wind carries the scent of nothingness, the sterile, sharp scent of frozen water and the faint, metallic tang of the stars. It is a wind that has traveled thousands of miles across the tundra, over the jagged peaks of the Chersky Range, gathering the silence of the wasteland as it goes. Here, at the edge of the Kolyma Highway, the wind is the only clock. Beneath the floorboards, the earth is a tomb of ice and history. The road of bones stretches out from the doorstep, a pale, shimmering ribbon of gravel and permafrost that winds its way through the mountains toward Magadan. It is a road built on the silence of those who came before, a road where every mile was paid for in breadth and endurance. The officer knows the road is there, even though he cannot see it through the thick, crystalline frost that has coated the window panes. The frost is beautiful and terrible, a delicate forest of silver ferns and frozen lace that has grown across the glass during the hours of darkness. It obscures the world outside, turning the moonlight into a soft, diffused glow that barely penetrates the room. It is a white light, cold and sterile, clashing gently with the warm, flickering yellow of the lamp. The two lights meet on the surface of the desk, creating a spectrum of pale gold and icy lavender that shifts with every flicker of the flame. He breathes, and the mist of his breath hangs in the air for a long moment, a ghost of warmth in the cooling room. It rises slowly, drifting toward the ceiling, where the shadows of the rafters lie in heavy, horizontal lines. The ceiling is low, the wood stained dark by years of wood smoke and the slow accumulation of soot. Every sound is muffled, dampened by the weight of the snow that sits 3 feet deep on the roof. The snow is a thick white quilt, insulating the outpost from the screams of the gale, turning the interior into a sanctuary of quiet, dull repetition. The officer listens to the ticking of a small tin clock that sits on a shelf above the stove. The sound is sharp and metallic, a rhythmic clicking that marks the passage of seconds that feel like hours. Tick, tick, tick. It is a small, insignificant sound against the vastness of the Kolyma, yet it is the only thing that keeps the silence from becoming total. The stove is the heart of the room, a squat, iron cylinder that radiates a dry, dusty heat. Inside, the embers of the larch logs are glowing a deep, translucent red, like the eyes of a subterranean creature. They do not flame, they only pulse, a slow, rhythmic ebb and flow of light that mirrors the breathing of the man at the desk. The heat from the stove smells of resin and old ash, a comforting, heavy scent that anchors the room in the present. Occasionally, a log will settle with a soft, hollow thud, sending a brief cascade of sparks against the iron door. The sound is muffled, as if it is happening underwater or in a distant room. Everything in this place is softened, rounded off by the cold, like the edges of a soft pastel drawing where the colors have been smudged together by a careful thumb. There are no sharp lines here, only gradients of shadow and light. On the desk, a logbook lies open. Its pages are yellowed and brittle, the edges curled by the humidity of the stove and the dryness of the frost. The writing inside is precise, a series of entries written in faded blue ink that tell the story of a day where nothing happened. The ink has soaked into the fibers of the paper, bleeding slightly at the edges to create a soft, blurred effect. 14:00, wind from the north. No traffic. 18:00, temperature falling. No traffic. 22:00, clear sky. No traffic. The words are a testament to the endurance of the mundane. The duty of the highway police is not one of action but of presence, to stay, to watch, to exist in the face of a landscape that wishes for nothing more than to erase all traces of human endeavor. The weight of this duty is visible in the slump of the officer's shoulders, in the way he leans his head slightly to the side, listening to the silence of the road. He reaches out a hand to the lamp, his fingers moving with a heavy, deliberate grace. The movement is so slow that the shadows on the wall barely seem to shift. He turns the small brass wheel, and the flame sinks lower, the yellow light receding until it is just a tiny, golden bead atop the wick. The room grows darker. The deep blues of the night outside seem to press closer against the glass, the indigo shadows of the corners expanding to swallow the desk and the chair. Now, the only light comes from the dying embers of the stove and the pale, ghostly glow of the moon filtering through the frosted window. The textures of the room change. The rough wool of his coat becomes a field of deep charcoal. The wood of the walls becomes a series of dark, vertical bands. The silence deepens. It is a heavy, velvet silence that fills the ears and settles in the lungs. The Kolyma Highway is a ribbon of memory, a path carved through the taiga where the trees are stunted and bent by the wind. They are black silhouettes against the snow, their branches heavy with rime ice that glitters like crushed diamonds in the dark. In the stillness of the night, one can almost hear the trees cracking under the tension of the cold, a sharp, sudden sound like a pistol shot that echoes through the valley and is immediately swallowed by the wind. The officer does not flinch. He is used to the sounds of the earth breaking. He is part of the stillness now, a figure drawn in soft, dark graphite, merging with the shadows of the outpost. His mind is a blank slate, reflecting the emptiness of the miles that surround him. There is no thought of the past, no anticipation of the future. There is only the cold, the wind, and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the clock. Outside, the snow begins to fall again. It does not fall in flakes, but in fine, dry grains that hiss against the timber walls like sand. It is a sound of erosion, a soft, abrasive whisper that speaks of the passage of time and the fragility of things built by hand. The snow fills the tracks of the day, smoothing over the ruts in the road, erasing the footprints of the officer's last walk to the woodpile. It is a slow, methodical process of disappearance. The blue-gray world becomes even more indistinct, the shapes of the hills blurring into the sky until everything is a single, monochromatic wash of deep, frozen space. The officer closes his eyes for a moment, and the darkness behind his eyelids is no different from the darkness of the room. He is a sentinel of the void, a guardian of a road that leads from nowhere to nowhere, through a land that has forgotten the sun. The sensation of the cold begins to change. It is no longer a sting, but a dull, humming numbness that starts at the tips of the fingers and the toes and moves slowly toward the center. It is a peaceful sensation, a loosening of the grip of the world. The weight of the wool coat feels lighter now, as if he is floating in a sea of thick, dark ink. The rhythm of his heart is the only thing left, a slow, steady drumbeat that echoes the ticking of the clock on the shelf. Thump, click, thump, click. The two sounds intertwine, creating a hypnotic loop that pulls the mind down into the depths of a dreamless sleep. The Kolyma does not demand much, only that one remains still, that one accepts the weight of the night without struggle. The officer leans back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight, a sound that is as familiar and comforting as his own breath. The officer rises from the heavy larch chair, a movement that takes a long, slow minute as his joints adjust to the stagnant, heavy air of the room. The chair creaks, a deep, resonant groan of seasoned wood that seems to vibrate through the soles of his boots. These boots are made of thick, blackened leather, layered with felt liners that have been compressed by years of use into a dense, unyielding mass. He stands for a moment, his head bowed, listening to the house settle. The silence of the outpost is not an absence of sound, but a collection of very small, very specific noises. The contraction of the logs in the frost, the hiss of the dying lamp wick, the dry, papery rustle of the logbook pages as the draft from his movement stirs them. The room is a capsule of stillness, a small pocket of amber light suspended in an ocean of indigo and slate. In the visual language of a soft pastel drawing, his figure is a dense, dark silhouette, defined not by sharp outlines, but by the way the warm light of the stove catches the rough texture of his woolen trousers and the matte finish of his heavy leather belt. The belt buckle, made of a dull, tarnished brass, catches a single glint of orange light, a tiny spark in a world of shadows. He moves toward the wood box beside the stove. Each step is deliberate, heavy with the weight of the layers he wears. He reaches down, and his fingers brush against the bark of a fresh log. It is larch dense, heavy, and cold. The bark is rough and scaly, flaking off in small, brittle shards that fall onto the floorboards with a sound like dry autumn leaves. He lifts the log, feeling the solid, frozen weight of it in his palms. This wood was harvested during the brief, mosquito-plagued summer, dried in the sun that never quite felt warm, and now it is the only thing standing between the officer and the devouring breath of the Siberian night. He opens the stove door. The hinges scream, a high, thin metallic sound that pierces the quiet like a needle. Inside, the bed of coals is a landscape of glowing canyons and crumbling mountains of ash. The heat hits his face, a sudden, dry pressure that makes his eyes sting. He places the log onto the embers. There is no immediate flame, only a low, visceral hiss as the remaining moisture in the wood is instantly turned to steam. He watches the red light crawl up the side of the log, illuminating the grain of the wood in vivid detail, making it look like a piece of polished mahogany before the soot begins to blacken it. He closes the door, and the room returns to its dim, monochromatic state. The heat begins to radiate again, a slow pulse that moves through the air in invisible waves. He walks toward the window, his shadow stretching out across the floor like a long, dark finger. The frost on the glass has thickened. It is no longer just a pattern of ferns. It has become a solid crust, a crystalline wall that separates the interior from the exterior. He takes a small metal scraper from the windowsill, a tool with a handle of worn birch. With a slow, rhythmic motion, he begins to clear a small circle in the center of the pane. The sound is abrasive, a rhythmic scritch that echoes in the hollow spaces of the room. The ice falls away in fine, white powder, accumulating on the sill like miniature drifts of snow. As the glass is revealed, the world outside begins to bleed through, not as a clear image, but as a smudge of deep, suffocating blue. Through the small circle of cleared glass, the Kolyma Highway reveals itself in the moonlight. It is a long, pale scar across the face of the earth, a line of gray-white that disappears into the gloom of the mountains. The road is not just a path. It is a monument to the mundane, a feat of engineering achieved through the slow, agonizing accumulation of human effort. In the 1930s and 40s, the administration of the Dalstroy camps oversaw the laying of this gravel, mile by agonizing mile. The history of the road is written in the logistics of hunger and the physics of the pickaxe against permafrost. There are no grand monuments here, only the road itself, which sits atop a foundation of crushed rock and the memory of those who moved it. The officer looks at the road and sees only the duty of maintenance. He thinks of the snowplows that are currently stalled in depots 100 miles away, their iron blades coated in grease and ice. He thinks of the bridge at the 200-kilometer mark. Its timber supports groaning under the weight of the frozen river. Everything is static. Everything is held in the grip of a cold so absolute that time itself seems to have crystallized. The visual outside is a masterclass in the use of dark pastels. The sky is a heavy wash of charcoal and indigo, layered so thickly that the stars appear not as points of light, but as faint, blurred smudges of pale yellow. The mountains are triangles of slate gray, their peaks lost in the low-hanging clouds that carry the next storm. There is no movement. The trees, the stunted, twisted larches, look like skeletal hands reaching out of the snow, their branches encrusted with a thick layer of rime that makes them look heavy and brittle. If a branch were to snap, it would sound like a bone breaking, but for now they are perfectly still. The wind has dropped for a moment, leaving a silence so profound that the officer can hear the faint, rhythmic thrumming of his own blood in his ears. It is a low-frequency vibration, a hum of life in a landscape of stasis. He turns away from the window and looks at the wall where a map is pinned. The map is old, its edges tattered and reinforced with yellowing tape. It shows the route from Magadan to Yakutsk, a serpentine line that winds through the Kolyma, Indigirka, and Yana River basins. The names of the outposts are written in a neat, bureaucratic hand, many of them now abandoned or reduced to seasonal shelters. This outpost, Station 48, is a tiny dot on that vast expanse, a speck of dust on the skin of a giant. The officer traces the line of the road with his eyes, following the contours of the mountains. He knows every curve, every steep grade where the trucks of the summer months struggle against the loose gravel. In the winter, the road is different. It is a solidified entity, a frozen river of stone and ice that requires a different kind of vigilance. He moves to the corner of the room where his equipment is kept. There is a heavy, felt-lined coat, a pair of fur-trimmed mittens, and a tall, cylindrical thermos made of chipped green enamel. He picks up the thermos. It is empty, its interior smelling faintly of stale tea and iron. He will need to melt snow for the morning. The process is slow. He must go out to the porch, scoop the clean, dry powder into a blackened pot, and wait for the stove to turn the crystals into liquid. Every action in this place is a series of smaller, tedious steps. There is no efficiency, only the slow, grinding reality of survival. He sets the thermos back down. The movement is precise, the sound of the metal hitting the wood of the shelf a dull, muffled thud. The air in the room is growing slightly warmer as the new log catches. The scent of burning larch fills the space, a sharp, resinous smell that is both comforting and harsh. It reminds him of the forests to the south, where the trees grow tall and straight, far from the reach of the permafrost. Here, the wood is a precious resource, counted and logged in ledgers with the same precision as the lives of the men who work the road. He thinks of the administrative office in Magadan, where clerks sit in heated rooms, filing reports on fuel consumption and tire wear. They exist in a different world, a world of paper and ink and scheduled breaks. Here, the only schedule is the one dictated by the weather. If the storm breaks, he will stay inside. If the road clears, he will walk his perimeter. He returns to the desk and sits. The wood of the chair is cold again, having lost the heat of his body during the minutes he was standing. He does not mind. The cold is a constant companion, a presence that he has learned to negotiate with. He picks up a pencil, a thick hexagonal shaft of cedar with a core of soft graphite. He holds it for a moment, feeling the texture of the wood. It is a simple tool, yet in this environment it feels substantial. He looks at the logbook, at the empty lines beneath the last entry. There is nothing to report, yet the report must be written. The bureaucracy of the Kolyma demands a record of the silence. He begins to write, the pencil moving slowly across the page. The sound of the graphite scratching against the paper is loud in the quiet room, a rhythmic, dry sound that matches the ticking of the clock. 0000, midnight. Visibility 10 meters, wind calm, no movement on the road. As he writes, the lamp beside him flickers. The oil is running low, the flame dancing on the edge of the wick. The shadows on the wall leap and dive, turning the room into a theater of shifting shapes. The officer does not look up. He is focused on the movement of the pencil, on the way the dark gray lead leaves a mark on the pale paper. It is a small act of creation in a world of erosion. When he finishes the entry, he lays the pencil down in the groove of the desk. He leans back and closes his eyes. The image of the road remains behind his eyelids, a pale, winding line through a dark, pencil-sketched forest. He can feel the weight of the highway, the millions of tons of stone and earth that press down upon the frozen soil. He can feel the silence of the thousands of miles of wilderness that surround his small timber outpost. The Kolyma is sleeping, but it is a heavy, restless sleep. Beneath the snow, the earth is shifting, the permafrost heaving and buckling in a slow-motion dance of geological time. The road adjusts with it, the gravel settling into new patterns, the ice filling the gaps. The officer is part of this adjustment. He is a component of the machine, a gear that turns once every 24 hours to ensure that the record remains unbroken. He breathes in the scent of the wood smoke and the cold, and he waits. The night is only half over. The deepest cold is yet to come, the hour before dawn when the mercury retreats into the bulb of the thermometer and the world becomes a brittle, crystalline void. He is ready for it. He is a man of the Kolyma, built of wool and leather and silence, a sentinel on the road of bones. The wind begins to pick up again, a low, mournful whistle that finds the gaps in the doorframe. It brings with it a fine mist of snow that settles on the threshold, a line of white powder that looks like salt. The officer watches it for a moment, then closes his eyes again. The rhythm of the wind, the ticking of the clock, and the slow, heavy pulse of his own heart merge into a single, hypnotic frequency. It is the sound of the North, a song without words, a story without an end. He drifts in the space between waking and sleep, a dark figure in a dark room, while outside the blue shadows of the Kolyma stretch out across the world, infinite and unchanging. The officer remains standing by the small circle of cleared glass for a long time, his breath creating a new, faint veil of mist that slowly crystallizes over the transparency he just fought to create. The transition from solid ice to clear glass and back to frost is the only cycle of change in this room. He looks at his reflection, a blurred and charcoal-smudged version of a face, eyes recessed into deep pits of indigo shadow, the skin of his forehead mapped with the same fine hatched lines that define the rough-hewn timber walls. In this light, the dying red of the stove and the pale, filtered moonlight, he looks like a sketch abandoned by an artist who preferred the shadows to the subject. He is a study in stillness. To move is to invite the cold to find the gaps in his clothing, so he moves with a deliberation that borders on the ritualistic. He turns his body away from the window, the heavy wool of his greatcoat brushing against the wall with a sound like sandpaper on soft pine. It is a dry, rasping noise that seems to linger in the corners of the room long after he has come to a stop. He realizes the kettle is nearly empty, and the air in his lungs feels brittle, as if the moisture is being drawn out of his very cells by the hungry, arid heat of the iron stove. He must go to the door. The door is a massive construction of double-layered planks, the space between them filled with sawdust and old wool, yet it feels as thin as paper against the pressure of the Siberian night. The latch is made of iron, hand-forged and pitted with age. As he reaches for it, he can see the frost creeping along the metal, a white, furry growth that seeks to weld the handle to the frame. He wraps his gloved hand around the iron. The cold of the metal bites through the thick leather and felt, a sharp electric sting that travels up his arm and settles in his shoulder. He pulls. The door does not open easily. The seal of ice along the threshold must be broken. He leans his weight into it, a slow, steady pressure of his entire frame. There is a sudden, sharp crack, the sound of a winter's worth of frozen condensation snapping at once. It is a violent sound in such a quiet place, like the breaking of a thick glass rod. He opens the door only a few inches, but it is enough. The outside world rushes in, not as wind, but as a solid, crystalline presence. The temperature in the room drops instantly, the warm air from the stove rushing out in a visible white cloud that roils and tumbles like heavy smoke. The contrast is stark. In the visual language of the drawing, the interior's warm ochres and burnt siennas are sliced through by a jagged, vertical line of freezing cobalt and stark, titanium white. He steps out onto the small, covered porch, his boots sinking into the fine, powdery snow that has drifted through the railings. The snow here is not wet. It is like flour or crushed bone, devoid of all moisture, a collection of tiny, sharp-edged stars that have never known the sun. He picks up a heavy iron pot that sits on a bench, its surface blackened by years of contact with the stove's direct heat. He plunges the pot into a clean drift, the sound a soft, muffled, hollow thud. He stands there for a moment, the door ajar behind him, looking out at the road of bones. From this vantage point, the highway is a series of soft, rolling curves of deep gray and blue, like the folds of a heavy velvet curtain. It is hard to believe that beneath this soft, pastel-shaded surface lies a foundation of such immense, static weight. The history of the Kolyma Highway, the M56, is not a history of grand speeches, but a history of cubic meters. Between 1932 and 1953, the road was pushed forward by the sheer, repetitive labor of thousands. The history is found in the records of the Dalstroy, the State Construction Trust. It is a history of gravel quotas, of the number of wheelbarrows filled per shift, of the precise amount of dynamite required to shatter a meter of permafrost. The road was not built. It was carved out of the very indifference of the earth. The gravel beneath his feet was hauled from riverbeds that remained frozen for 10 months of the year, moved by hand, laid down in layers, and compacted by the passage of heavy, slow-moving trucks. It is a road of logistics, a road of endurance, where the primary enemy was never a person, but the simple, unyielding physics of the cold. The officer looks up at the sky. The clouds have parted slightly, revealing a vertical sliver of the cosmos. The stars are not twinkling. They are hard, steady points of cold light, embedded in the black-blue velvet of the firmament. They look like flecks of white chalk on a dark board. There is a sense of immense distance, an architectural scale to the night that makes the outpost feel smaller than a grain of sand. He breathes in, and the cold air sears his throat, a sharp metallic taste that lingers on the tongue. It is the taste of the north, clean, empty, and ancient. He retreats back inside, pulling the heavy door shut and dropping the iron bar into its cradle with a resonant, heavy clack. The silence returns, but it is different now, infused with the scent of the fresh snow sitting in the pot. He places the pot on the flat top of the stove. The snow inside is so cold that it does not melt immediately. Instead, it begins to hiss, a tiny, high-pitched whistle as the bottom layer of crystals sublimates directly into steam. He watches it. This is a process that cannot be rushed. To melt enough snow for a single cup of tea takes time, a commodity he has in abundance. He stands by the stove, the heat beginning to seep back into his coat, the wool smelling of damp sheep and wood smoke. He thinks about the tea he will make. It is brick tea, compressed, dark, and bitter. It comes in hard, rectangular blocks that must be broken off with a knife. It is a utilitarian drink, designed for preservation and transport, a staple of the frontier for centuries. It does not offer the delicate notes of a spring harvest. It offers the heavy, tannic weight of survival. It is the color of the earth, the color of the shadows in the corners of the room. The water begins to form at the bottom of the pot, a dark, shimmering ring beneath the white mound of snow. He takes a long wooden spoon and presses down on the drift, encouraging the transformation. The sound is a soft, wet slush, a rhythmic squelch that marks the minutes. Press, squelch, wait. The stove pulses. The light in the room remains low, the single lantern now extinguished to save fuel, leaving only the red glow of the fire to define the space. In this light, the room looks like a cavern, the walls receding into an infinite, textured black. The officer's hands, illuminated by the stove's door, are a deep orange, the shadows between his fingers as dark as the road outside. He is a part of this chiaroscuro, a figure formed by the absence of light as much as by its presence. As the water begins to simmer, the officer thinks of the silence of the trucks. In the summer, the road is a corridor of noise, the grinding of gears, the roar of diesel engine, the rattle of stones against metal fenders. The trucks carry everything: fuel for the generators, flour for the bakeries, spare parts for the mines. But in the deep winter, the traffic slows to a trickle and then stops. The engines cannot be turned off. If they stop, the oil becomes solid, the coolant freezes, and the metal becomes as brittle as glass. A truck that stops on the Kolyma in January becomes a permanent part of the landscape unless it is kept running. This is why the silence of the night is so significant. It means that for hundreds of miles, nothing is moving. The entire infrastructure of the region is holding its breath, waiting for the slight softening of the air that comes with the spring. He pours the hot water into a chipped ceramic mug, the liquid a dark, translucent amber. The steam rises in a thick column, catching the red light of the stove and turning into a plume of fire before vanishing into the shadows of the ceiling. He takes the mug to the desk and sits. The tea is hot, almost scalding, a welcome shock to his system. He drinks slowly, feeling the warmth travel down his throat and into his chest, a small, internal fire to match the one in the stove. The mug is heavy in his hands, its surface rough and cool where the tea does not touch it. He looks at the logbook again. The page is still there, the entry he made an hour ago still the last word on the state of the world. 0000, midnight. Visibility 10 meters, wind calm, no movement on the road. He thinks about the distance. Magadan is over 1,000 kilometers to the south and east. Yakutsk is even further to the west. Between them lies nothing but the taiga and the mountains, a wilderness so vast it defies the human imagination. This road is the only thread that connects these isolated pockets of humanity. It is a fragile thread, easily broken by a landslide, a flood, or a particularly heavy storm. And yet, it persists. It is maintained by men like him, men who sit in small rooms and watch the snow fall, men who record the silence in yellowed ledgers. There is a dignity in this boredom, a quiet, stoic pride in the simple act of remaining. The Kolyma Highway is not just a path for vehicles. It is a declaration of presence in a place that offers no welcome. The wind outside begins to rise again, a low, guttural moan that vibrates through the logs of the wall. It is a sound that seems to come from the earth itself, a resonant frequency that bypasses the ears and settles in the gut. It is the sound of the permafrost shifting, of the ice expanding in the cracks of the mountains. The officer listens, his head slightly tilted. He knows this sound. It is the prelude to the deeper cold, the sign that the atmosphere is thickening, becoming even more opaque. He sets his mug down on the desk, the sound a soft, muffled thud on the wood. He feels a wave of lethargy wash over him, a heavy, velvet tiredness that is not quite sleep, but a state of suspended animation. The repetitive nature of his life, the melting of the snow, the drinking of the tea, the writing of the log is a form of meditation. It strips away the unnecessary, leaving only the essential, the breath, the heat, the duty. The visual scene remains static. The dark surface of the drawing is covered in layers of blue and gray, with the small, warm glow of the stove acting as the only focal point. The textures are rich, the grain of the wood, the weave of the wool, the crystalline structure of the frost on the window. Everything is soft, blurred at the edges, as if seen through a veil of falling snow or a tired pair of eyes. The officer is a shadow among shadows, a quiet guardian of a road built on bones and silence. He closes his eyes and the world outside ceases to exist. There is only the warmth of the tea in his belly and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Tick, tick, tick. Each second is a mile on the long, dark road of the night. He is exactly where he is supposed to be. He is the witness to the stillness. The Kolyma does not change. The mountains do not move. The road remains a pale line in the dark, waiting for the morning that is still many hours away. The officer breathes out, a long, slow sigh that disappears into the gloom. He is content in his boredom, satisfied by the weight of the silence. He is the police of the highway, the keeper of the record, the man who stays when everything else has stopped. The night continues its slow, heavy crawl toward the dawn, and he is ready to meet it, one slow, repetitive moment at a time. The interior of the outpost has reached a state of thermal equilibrium, a delicate and temporary balance where the fading heat of the stove and the encroaching pressure of the exterior cold meet in the middle of the room. The officer remains seated at his desk, his presence as static as the heavy timbers that surround him. In the visual language of the dark pastel drawing, his figure is now almost entirely rendered in shades of deep Payne's gray and charcoal, with only the slightest rim of burnt orange highlighting the curve of his shoulder, where the embers still cast a faint, dying glow. The air in the room has become so still that it feels viscous, like a heavy fluid that requires effort to move through. Every breath he takes is a slow, measured event. He watches the mist of his exhalation as it leaves his lips, a pale, translucent cloud that hangs suspended for a heartbeat before it begins to drift toward the floor, cooling rapidly and losing its form. It is a visual representation of the energy leaving his body, a slow leakage of warmth into the vast, hungry void of the Siberian night. He looks down at the desk. The surface is a landscape of grain and shadow, the rough-hewn larchwood showing the marks of the adze and the saw from decades ago. These marks are filled with the fine, dark dust of graphite and soot, creating a texture that is rich and tactile even in the dim light. He reaches for a small wooden box that sits at the edge of the desk, his hand moving with the glacial pace of a man who knows that any sudden exertion will only hasten the arrival of the cold. The box contains a collection of small, utilitarian items, a spare wick for the lamp, a handful of iron nails, a piece of dry leather for stropping his knife, and a small, rectangular block of graphite. He picks up the graphite block. It is heavy for its size, cold and slick to the touch. He turns it over in his fingers, feeling the smooth, matte surface. In the 1940s, such items were luxury goods, transported thousands of miles from the industrial centers of the West to these remote outposts. Everything here has a history of travel, a history of being carried over the mountains and through the forests by horse, by truck, or by hand. The history of the Kolyma is a history of weight. To build anything here, a house, a bridge, a road, is to engage in a struggle against the very density of the earth. The highway itself, the M56, is a marvel of primitive and persistent engineering. The officer thinks of the layering method used by the construction brigades. Because the ground is permafrost, a solid mass of ice and soil that reaches hundreds of meters deep, the road cannot simply be dug. To dig into the permafrost is to invite the summer sun to melt the foundation, turning the highway into a bottomless moraine of mud. Instead, the road was built upward. First, a raft of logs, mostly larch, which does not rot in the cold, was laid directly onto the frozen moss. Upon this raft, layers of coarse gravel and crushed rock were piled, hauled from the riverbanks and processed by hand. The road is a mound, a raised embankment that sits on top of the world, insulating the ice below from the heat above. It is a structural paradox, a road that depends on the permanence of ice to remain stable, yet must be thick enough to prevent that ice from ever feeling the sun. He sets the graphite block back into the box with a soft, hollow click. He must check the external thermometer. This is a task that occurs every 4 hours, a ritual that provides a numerical value to the invisible force that surrounds him. He prepares himself for the transition. He pulls his greatcoat tighter around his chest, the heavy wool overlapping in a thick, insulating barrier. He checks the fastenings of his Valenki, the tall, gray felt boots that are the only true defense against the ground's lethal temperature. The Valenki are seamless, made by agitating wool with water and steam until it becomes a dense, matted shell. They are not elegant, but they are effective. They have no soles in the traditional sense. He wears them inside thick rubber overshoes to protect the wool from the dry, abrasive snow. He rises from the chair, the movement causing the floorboards to groan. A deep, low-frequency sound that seems to travel through the wood and into his own bones. He walks toward the door, his shadow elongating across the floor until it climbs the wall and disappears into the rafters. The light from the stove is a mere slit now, a thin line of red that marks the edge of the door's iron frame. He reaches for the heavy wooden bar. It is smooth from use, the grain polished by the oils of 100 different hands. He lifts it. The sound of wood sliding against wood is a dry, resonant hiss. He pulls the door open just wide enough to slip through, and the cold hits him with the force of a physical blow. It is not like the wind. It is a static pressure, a sudden solidification of the air around him. The temperature outside has dropped further. He can feel the moisture on his eyeballs beginning to crystallize, a faint, scratchy sensation that forces him to blink slowly. On the porch, the world is a study in monochromatic depth. The blue has intensified, becoming a saturated, ink-like indigo that defines the curves of the snowdrifts and the jagged outlines of the mountains. The drawing here would be made with heavy, broad strokes of a dark blue pastel, with fine, sharp lines of white to represent the highlights of the rime ice on the railings. The air is perfectly still. There is no sound, none at all. The silence of the Kolyma at -50 degrees is absolute. It is a silence that has a physical presence. A ringing in the ears that suggests the atmosphere itself has become too brittle to carry sound. He moves to the corner of the porch, where the thermometer is housed in a small, slatted wooden box, designed to protect the instrument from the direct light of the moon and any stray gusts of wind. He leans in close, his breath held to avoid obscuring the glass tube with a cloud of mist. The thermometer is a long, delicate instrument filled with a specialized spirit dyed a deep, dark red. Mercury would be useless here. It freezes at -38 degrees, turning into a solid, useless plug of metal. The spirit, however, remains liquid. He peers at the scale, the numbers etched into the silvered backing of the housing. The red line has retreated far down into the bulb. It sits at -52. At this temperature, the physics of everyday life begin to fail. Steel becomes as brittle as porcelain. A dropped wrench will shatter into a dozen pieces. Rubber becomes hard and inflexible. Human flesh, if exposed, will freeze in minutes, the cells rupturing as the water within them turns to jagged ice. The officer records the number in his mind, a single data point in the long, dark history of the station. He looks out toward the road. From this elevation, he can see a section of the highway as it bends around the base of a nearby hill. It is a pale, ghostly ribbon, illuminated by the cold light of 1,000,000 distant stars. There is a strange luminescence to the snow at this temperature, a faint, phosphorescent glow that seems to come from within the crystals themselves. It is the light of the void, reflected and refracted through 1,000,000,000,000 tiny prisms. He thinks of the distance between this porch and the next sign of human life. To the north, the road climbs toward the passes of the Verkhansk Range, a wilderness of rock and ice where the wind never truly dies. To the south, it descends toward the river valleys, where the trees grow slightly taller but the cold settles even more deeply in the lowlands. He is a solitary point in an infinite grid, a witness to a landscape that requires no audience. The history of the Road of Bones is often told in whispers, focused on the tragedy of its construction. But for the officer, the history is more mechanical, more grounded in the reality of the materials. He thinks of the thousands of cubic meters of rock that had to be quarried, crushed, and transported. He thinks of the logistics of the ZIS-5 trucks, the sturdy, wooden-cabined vehicles that were the workhorses of the Kolyma. In the winter, these trucks would travel in convoys, their engines never stopping, their headlights cutting through the dark like the eyes of deep-sea creatures. If a truck broke down, the convoy would stop, and the drivers would work in the killing cold to fix the problem, their hands protected by layers of grease and wool. It was a war of attrition against the environment, a slow-motion battle where the only victory was the completion of the journey. The road is the battlefield, and the snow is the silent victor that eventually covers everything. He turns to go back inside, but a movement in the distance catches his eye. He freezes, his body becoming as still as the trees. Far down the road, at the very edge of his vision, there is a flicker. It is not a light, but a change in the texture of the shadows. He waits, his heart beating a slow, steady rhythm in his chest. Thump, thump, thump. He watches the spot where the road disappears into the dark. After a long minute, he realizes it is nothing, just the shifting of the light as a cloud passes across the moon, or perhaps the settling of a snowdrift under its own weight. In this place, the mind seeks patterns in the void, inventing movement where there is only stasis. The isolation is a weight that presses on the psyche, just as the cold presses on the body. He exhales, a long, slow plume of white, and steps back into the outpost. The transition back into the room is a slow thawing. He bars the door and stands for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dim, red glow of the stove. The air feels thick and tropical compared to the exterior, though the temperature in the room is barely above freezing. He moves back to the desk and picks up the pencil. The graphite is cold, but the wood of the pencil has retained a ghost of the room's warmth. He opens the logbook to the next line. 0400, temperature -52. Atmosphere clear. No traffic. The words are a small, defiant act of record-keeping. They transform the vast, terrifying emptiness of the night into a series of manageable facts. He is the clerk of the apocalypse, the man who counts the degrees as the world descends into ice. He sits back in the chair, the heavy wool of his coat scratching against the backrest. The sound is like the rustling of dry grass in a summer field, a memory of a different world. He thinks of the tea he drank earlier, the warmth of it now a distant memory. He will not make more. The effort of melting snow is too great for this hour. Instead, he will sit and wait for the first gray light of the dawn. The dawn in the Kolyma is not a sudden event. It is a slow, agonizingly gradual transition from black to deep blue, then to a pale, sickly gray that offers no warmth. It is hours away yet. Between now and then, there is only the ticking of the clock and the slow pulse of the stove. The visual scene in the room has shifted. The shadows are longer now, the red light of the stove fading as the embers are covered by a layer of white ash. The texture of the walls is more pronounced, the rough grain of the larch logs looking like the skin of an ancient animal. The officer is a part of this texture, his face a map of shadows and lines. He is a figure in a dark pastel drawing, a study in endurance and boredom. He closes his eyes not to sleep, but to retreat into the inner world where the cold cannot reach. He thinks of the road, the long, pale line of gravel and bone, and he feels a strange sense of peace. He is the guardian of the highway. He is the one who stays. The night is heavy, the cold is absolute, and the duty is eternal. The wind begins to whisper again, a soft, dry sound like the brushing of a wing against the window. It is a lonely sound, the song of a world that has no need for humans. The officer listens, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the house. He is exactly where he needs to be, a small spark of consciousness in the middle of the frozen dark. He is the police of the Kolyma, and his watch is far from over. The room has entered the hour of the deepest blue. It is a time when the light of the stove has retreated into a tiny, pulsing core of violet and crimson, and the moonlight through the frosted window has turned into a sharp, clinical silver. The officer sits in his chair, his body, a heavy, dark mass that seems to have merged with the shadows of the timber walls. In the visual style of a soft pastel drawing, this scene would be rendered with thick, horizontal strokes of indigo and Payne's gray, the charcoal paper beneath showing through to provide a gritty, tactile texture. The edges of his silhouette are not sharp, they are smudged, a soft transition from the rough wool of his greatcoat to the dark, grain-heavy wood of the room. He does not move. He has become a part of the architecture of the outpost, a structural element designed to endure the weight of the silence. His hands remain on the desk, the skin looking like pale parchment in the moonlight, the veins a faint, marble-like tracer of blue beneath the surface. He is listening to the house. The timbers of the Kolyma outpost are not silent. They are constantly speaking in the language of the cold. A long, low creak echoes from the rafters, the sound of the wood contracting, losing the last of its internal moisture to the absolute dryness of the air. It is a rhythmic sound, occurring at long, predictable intervals, like the slow ticking of a geological clock. He thinks about the history of the materials that surround him. The larch logs of the outpost were not grown in a forest of towering giants. They were harvested from the stunted, twisted stands of the northern taiga, where a tree might take 100 years to reach the thickness of a man's thigh. The wood is incredibly dense, its growth rings so close together they are almost invisible to the naked eye. This density is what makes it strong enough to resist the ice, but it also makes it a conduit for the cold. He can feel the temperature of the wall behind him, a slow, radiant chill that moves through the wood and the layers of his coat to settle between his shoulder blades. It is a persistent sensation, a reminder that the warmth he created earlier was merely a temporary illusion. The Kolyma is a place where the earth is frozen to a depth of hundreds of meters, a permanent state of being that the brief, pale summers can never truly alter. The officer is sitting atop this frozen pillar of history, a man suspended over a void of ice. His gaze drifts to the logbook, the white pages now a cool, bluish-gray in the moonlight. He thinks about the administrative machinery that necessitates this book. The Dalstre, the vast state organization that managed the Kolyma, was a masterpiece of cold, detached logistics. It operated on the principle of the quota, the Urok. Every task was measured in cubic meters of earth, kilograms of gold, or kilometers of road. The history of the M56 is the history of the Urok. He recalls the technical manuals for road construction in the permafrost, documents printed on cheap, gray paper that detailed the exact ratio of gravel to rock required for a stable embankment. The road was never intended to be a masterpiece of masonry. It was a functional necessity, a way to move resources from the interior to the coast. It was built by the Brigada, groups of men whose names are largely lost to time, but whose collective effort is visible in every curve of the highway. They worked in the layering method, first the logs, then the brushwood, then the gravel. It was a process of accumulation, a slow building up of a barrier against the unstable, melting world beneath. The visual outside the window has changed slightly. The moon is higher now, and its light is more direct, casting long, sharp shadows across the snow. The drawing would show the snow as a series of soft, rolling mounds of pale lavender and white, with the shadows of the stunted larches appearing as jagged, blue-black spikes. These trees are the only things that break the horizontal monotony of the landscape. They are warped by the prevailing winds, their trunks leaning toward the south as if in a permanent gesture of supplication. In the deep winter, they do not look like living things. They look like sculptures made of iron and glass. If the officer were to go out and strike one with a hammer, it would not thud. It would ring like a bell. The cold has turned the organic into the mineral, stripping away the softness of life and replacing it with the rigidity of the earth. He feels the weight of the wool against his skin. It is a heavy, comforting irritation, a texture that he has lived with for so long that he no longer notices it unless he focuses his mind. The wool is coarse, unrefined, and smells of old smoke and the faint, acidic scent of his own sweat. It is the smell of survival. Inside the boots, his feet are beginning to lose the pins and needles sensation of the warmth and are settling into a dull, heavy numbness. He knows he should move, should stand up and pace the room to keep the blood flowing, but the effort seems monumental. The stillness is too seductive. It is easier to remain as he is, a figure of graphite and shadow, watching the moon move across the sky. The ticking of the clock on the shelf has become the heartbeat of the room, a dry, metallic tick-tock that slices the silence into perfectly even, perfectly boring segments. The history of the Kolyma Highway is also the history of the vehicles that traversed it. He thinks of the ZIS-5 trucks, the 3-tonners, with their vertical radiators and wooden-framed cabs. These machines were the lifeblood of the road. In the deep winter, a driver's life depended on his ability to keep the engine running. They would use blowtorches to heat the oil pans, or build small fires under the chassis to thaw the grease in the differentials. The air in the cab was barely warmer than the air outside, the only heat coming from the engine block through the thin metal of the firewall. The drivers wore sheepskin coats and felt boots, their faces covered in layers of grease to protect against frostbite. They moved in convoys, the headlamps of the lead truck cutting a pale, flickering path through the drifting snow. To the officer, these trucks are not just machines. They are fellow inhabitants of the cold, entities that struggle against the same entropic forces that threaten his own existence. He can almost hear the ghostly rumble of a diesel engine in the distance, a low-frequency hum that turns out to be nothing more than the wind vibrating the iron stovepipe. The stovepipe is a long, blackened cylinder that rises from the stove and exits through the wall. It is covered in a layer of soot that absorbs the light, making it look like a hole in the reality of the room. At the point where it meets the wall, there is a ring of silver-white frost where the hot air of the exhaust has met the killing cold of the exterior. This ring is a microcosm of the entire Kolyma, a thin, precarious boundary where the heat of human endeavor meets the absolute zero of the wilderness. The officer watches a single flake of soot detach from the pipe and drift slowly toward the floor. Its movement is erratic, caught in a tiny, invisible thermal current before it finally settles on the dark wood. It is a small event, a tiny shift in the composition of the room, yet in the total stillness of the night, it feels significant. He picks up the pencil again. It is a simple tool, a shaft of cedar with a core of graphite, but it is his only means of communication with the world beyond the station. He looks at the logbook. The blue ink of the earlier entries has faded into the shadows, leaving only the dark gray of the pencil marks he made at 4 in the morning. He feels a sudden, inexplicable urge to write something more than just a report. He wants to describe the way the blue of the sky feels like it is pressing against his temples, or the way the silence seems to have a weight of its own, like a blanket of lead. But he doesn't. The bureaucracy of the station does not allow for poetry. It requires only the facts. He rests the tip of the pencil on the paper, but he does not move it. The graphite leaves a tiny, dark dot, a period at the end of a sentence that has not yet been written. The visual scene is now almost entirely monochromatic. The reds and oranges of the stove are gone, replaced by the silver and blue of the moon. The room is a study in texture. The rough grain of the logs, the weave of the wool, the smooth surface of the paper, the cold hardness of the iron. Everything is rendered with a heavy hand, the shadows deep and opaque, the highlights sharp and crystalline. The officer is a ghost in this landscape, a man of gray and charcoal who exists in the spaces between the lines. He closes his eyes and the image of the road returns to him, the M56, the road of bones stretching out into the dark. He can see it from above, a pale, winding thread that binds the mountains together. It is a lonely road, a road that asks for nothing and gives nothing in return. It is the spine of the Kolyma, and he is one of the nerves that keeps it alive. The history of the road is written in the gravel. Every kilometer post is a marker of effort. In the 1930s, the posts were made of wood painted white with black numbers. In the winter, they would become encrusted with rime ice, turning into tall, white ghosts that guided the drivers through the blizzards. The officer remembers a story about a post at the 500-kilometer mark that was buried by a landslide and then dug out again by hand over the course of 3 days, just so the drivers would know where they were. That is the nature of the work here. It is not about progress. It is about maintenance. It is about keeping the signs visible, the road passable, and the records accurate. It is a quiet, repetitive battle against the erasure of the world. The wind outside has shifted to the northeast, bringing with it a more aggressive, high-pitched whistle. It finds the tiny gaps in the window frame and pushes through, creating a faint, whistling sound that matches the rhythm of the officer's breathing. He can feel the temperature in the room dropping further. The air is becoming so cold that it feels thin, as if the oxygen itself is being crowded out by the chill. He knows he should add more wood to the stove, but the wood box is empty, and the walk to the porch feels like a journey of 1,000 miles. He decides to wait. The cold is a heavy, velvet weight that pulls at his eyelids, a hypnotic force that promises a deep, dreamless rest. He resists it, but only slightly. He is a man of the Kolyma, and he knows that the cold is not the enemy. It is simply the condition of his life. He remains in the chair, a dark figure against a dark wall, while the silver moonlight continues to crawl across the floor. The night is a long, slow process of cooling, a gradual descent into the absolute stillness of the dawn. He is the witness to this descent, the man who stays to record the exact moment when the world stops moving. The Kolyma Highway is silent, the road of bones is white, and the officer is part of the drawing. A smudge of charcoal on a blue-gray background, a sentinel of the frozen dark. The hour between 5 and 6 in the morning is the time when the Kolyma truly belongs to the silence. It is a period of transition where the moon has descended behind the jagged peaks of the Chersky Range, leaving the sky in a state of deep, bruised purple, a shade so thick it feels like it could be carved with a palette knife. In the visual language of the soft pastel drawing, the outpost is now a study in the heaviest blues, the shadows so dense they possess a physical grain, like the texture of rough-toothed paper beneath a layer of charcoal. The officer remains in his chair, his body now a singular, monolithic shape of dark wool and shadow. He has entered a state of hibernation, his heart rate slowed to the bare minimum required to maintain the ghost of warmth in his core. He watches the window. The frost has grown during the last hour, the silver ferns now thick and opaque, turning the glass into a slab of translucent marble. Through the small circle he cleared earlier, the world is a blur of indigo and slate. There is no movement on the road. The road of bones is a silent, frozen artery, its gravel veins locked in a permanent stasis. He thinks about the composition of that gravel. It is not uniform. The history of the highway is recorded in the varying textures of the stone that makes up its surface. In some sections, the rock is a jagged, dark basalt, crushed by hand in the quarries of the 1940s. In others, it is a smoother, paler river stone, hauled from the beds of the Kolyma and its tributaries during the brief windows of the summer melt. To the uninitiated, it is simply a road, but to the officer who has walked segments of it in all seasons, the road is a geological ledger. He can tell the age of a section by the way the stones have settled, the way the frost has pushed the larger rocks to the surface, creating a pavement of jagged teeth that can shred a heavy truck tire in a matter of miles. The maintenance of this surface is a labor of Sisyphus. Every spring, the heaving permafrost buckles the road, and every autumn, the rains wash the fine silt away, leaving the heavy stones behind. It is a road that is constantly trying to return to the earth, to dissolve back into the mountains and the taiga. He looks down at his hands. They are resting on the logbook, and in the low light they seem to be made of the same gray material as the paper. He picks up the pencil, feeling the slight vibration of the wood against his thumb. The graphite is soft, a 4B lead that leaves a rich, dark mark with very little pressure. He thinks about the pencils themselves, simple tools, yet essential for the bureaucracy of the North. They are made of cedar, a wood that remains stable in the extreme dryness of the outpost, unlike the cheaper pines that would warp and split. The graphite is a mineral, a form of carbon that, like the coal in the mines further north, was formed over millions of years of pressure and heat. There is a symmetry in using a piece of the ancient earth to record the passage of time on a road built over the ancient ice. He makes a small mark on the edge of the page, a test of the point. The sound is a soft, grainy whisper, a friction that is the only audible thing in the room besides his own breath. The history of the Kolyma is also the history of the baza, the supply depots that sit at intervals along the highway. These depots are the reason the road exists. They are the collection points for the gold, the coal, and the timber that the region yields so reluctantly. The officer thinks of the depot at the 150-kilometer mark, a collection of low, windowless warehouses built of the same gray larch as his outpost. Inside those warehouses, the air is even colder than it is here, the silence even more profound. They hold the spare parts for the ZIS-5 and GAZA trucks, the massive iron drums of winter-grade diesel that flows like molasses at these temperatures, and the sacks of grain that are as hard as concrete. The logistics of the Kolyma are a masterpiece of endurance. Every nail, every bolt, every liter of fuel must be accounted for and transported through a landscape that actively resists movement. The road is the only way through, and the police of the highway are the ones who ensure that the flow of resources, however slow, never truly stops. The sensation of the cold in the room has reached a new stage. It is no longer an external force. It has become an internal one. He can feel it in his joints, a stiff, crystalline resistance to movement. His breath comes in long, slow cycles, the mist now settling on the lapels of his greatcoat as a fine white rime. In the drawing, this would be represented by tiny, delicate strokes of white pencil, a dusting of light on the dark gray wool. The texture of the coat is fascinating in this light. The way the fibers of the wool are matted and compressed, creating a surface that looks like the bark of a tree or the skin of an elephant. It is a garment of utility, designed to trap air and exclude the wind, a portable fortress for the human body. He pulls the collar slightly higher, the movement so slow that the shadows on the wall do not even seem to flicker. He thinks about the bridge at the 210-kilometer mark. It is a timber trestle bridge, a complex lattice of larch beams that spans a deep, rocky gorge. In the winter, the river below is a solid mass of ice, but the bridge still groans under the weight of the frost. The ice expands in the joints of the wood, pushing the beams apart, while the weight of the snow on the deck pulls them down. It is a structure in constant tension, a mechanical struggle that mirrors his own. Every week, he is supposed to inspect the bridge, to walk its length and listen for the sounds of structural failure. In this cold, the wood becomes as brittle as glass. He imagines the bridge as it appears now in the moonlight, a delicate, silver-gray web of frost and timber, suspended over a void of absolute black. It is a beautiful and terrifying thing, a testament to the fragility of human construction in the face of the Kolyma. The visual scene remains static, yet there is a subtle shift in the color palette. The deep blues are being infused with a faint, ghostly gray, the first indication that the sun is beginning its long, slow climb toward the horizon. It is not yet light, but the darkness is losing its depth. The drawing would show this transition as a layering of light gray chalk over the indigo base, a soft blending that creates a sense of immense, cold space. The textures are becoming more visible. He can see the grain of the floorboards, the individual knots in the wood looking like dark, staring eyes. He can see the soot on the stovepipe, a matte black surface that seems to drink what little light is in the room. He can see the dust on the desk, a fine gray powder that has settled over the years, a record of the stillness of the outpost. He thinks about the silence of the mines. Far to the north, beyond the mountains, the earth is hollowed out by tunnels. There the temperature is constant, a steady, freezing -5 degrees, regardless of the blizzard on the surface. The history of the Kolyma gold mines is a history of the Sherfy, the test pits dug into the permafrost to find the pay streak. The process was slow and repetitive. First, a fire was built on the ground to thaw the top few inches of soil. Then the softened earth was scraped away. Then another fire and another layer of earth. It was a rhythmic, vertical journey into the past, a slow-motion descent into the frozen history of the world. The road he guards is the path that gold takes to reach the sea. Every truck that passes his window in the summer carries the weight of that effort, the labor of the fires and the scrapers. In the winter, the mines are quiet, the machinery covered in tarpaulins and ice, waiting for the return of the light. The officer's mind drifts to the concept of the white darkness. This is the phenomenon that occurs during a heavy blizzard, when the sky and the ground become a single, featureless void of blowing snow. In a white darkness, there is no horizon, no up or down, no sense of distance. A man can get lost 10 feet from his door, his senses overwhelmed by the lack of contrast. He looks at the window, grateful for the clarity of the night, however cold it may be. The stillness is a luxury. It allows for the maintenance of the record, for the slow, methodical process of watching and waiting. He is a man who thrives in the absence of stimulation. His life is measured in the consumption of firewood, the volume of tea, and the number of entries in the logbook. It is a boring existence, and in that boredom, there is a profound sense of safety. The Kolyma cannot hurt a man who has already become as still as the mountains. The wind begins a new movement. It is no longer a whistle, but a low-frequency thrumming, a vibration that seems to originate from the very foundations of the earth. It is the sound of the wind crossing the vast, open expanses of the tundra, gathering strength as it moves toward the mountains. It hits the outpost with a heavy, muffled thud, causing the logs to shiver. The officer feels the vibration through the soles of his boots. It is a reminder that the world is still alive, that the stillness is merely a mask for a much larger, more powerful force. He thinks of the weather stations at the high passes, the lonely outposts where the anemometers spin so fast they create a high-pitched scream. Here, in the valley, he is sheltered, but he is never entirely removed from the power of the north. He reaches for the pencil one last time before the next scheduled check. He writes a single word in the margin of the logbook: endurance. It is not a report, it is a statement of fact. The word is small, written in a neat, unassuming hand, yet it carries the weight of the entire night. The graphite marks are dark and solid on the pale paper, a physical manifestation of his presence in this place. He lays the pencil down in the groove of the desk and leans back. The wood of the chair is cold, the wool of his coat is heavy, and the air is brittle with the approach of dawn. He is exactly where he is supposed to be. He is the guardian of the M56, the witness to the silence, the man of the Kolyma. The visual scene is now a pale, cold gray. The blue has retreated into the corners, leaving the center of the room in a flat, clinical light that reveals every crack and every shadow. The drawing is reaching its final layers, the soft, gray pastels applied with a light touch, the dark charcoal outlines refined but never sharpened. The officer is a figure of infinite patience, a smudge of dark gray in a world of silver and slate. He closes his eyes and listens to the thrumming of the wind, a sound that has no beginning and no end, a story that is told in the language of the ice. The night is almost over, but the cold is eternal, and the road remains, a pale line in the dark, waiting for the first light of a sun that offers no warmth. The gray light of the approaching dawn is not an arrival of clarity, but a different kind of obscurity. It is a flat, clinical wash that begins to seep into the room, eroding the deep indigo shadows of the night and replacing them with a monochromatic slate. In the visual language of the soft pastel drawing, the dark surface of the board is now being covered with thick, horizontal strokes of a pale, dusty gray, layered over the heavy charcoal base. The edges of the room, the corners where the larch logs meet, the underside of the heavy rafters, the gap behind the iron stove, remain stubbornly dark, but the center of the space is slowly becoming visible in all its utilitarian detail. The officer remains in his chair, a figure of dark gray wool and stillness. He has not moved for a long time. His hands, still resting on the yellowed pages of the logbook, look like sculptures carved from a cold, porous stone. He watches the transformation of the light with a patient, unblinking gaze. There is no joy in the coming of the morning. In the Kolyma, the sun is a distant, disinterested spectator that offers light without warmth, a pale disk that barely clears the horizon before beginning its descent back into the frozen dark. He thinks about the history of the snow that blankets the road. To the casual observer, it is a uniform white, but to the officer, it is a complex stratigraphic record of the winter. Each layer represents a different storm, a different shift in the wind, a different drop in the mercury. There is the depth hoar at the bottom, a layer of faceted, sugary crystals that form near the warm earth and provide no stability. Above that are the hard, wind-packed slabs, as dense as plywood, created by the relentless gales of December. On top is the fine, abrasive powder of the current week, a layer that has never known a temperature above -40. The maintenance of the M56 depends on an intimate understanding of these layers. In the 1940s, clearing the road was a task of immense, manual repetition. The vanguard teams would move ahead of the trucks, using long iron bars to break the crust and wooden shovels to throw the snow into the ditches. It was a rhythmic, collective effort, a slow-motion dance of labor against the accumulation of the sky. The road is not just a path. It is a space that must be constantly reclaimed from the weight of the atmosphere. He rises from the chair, and the sound of his movement is like the cracking of a frozen river. His joints, stiffened by the hours of inactivity and the persistent chill, protest with a dull internal ache. He ignores it. The ache is a constant, a baseline of existence in this latitude. He moves toward the stove, his shadow a long, distorted shape that slides across the floorboards. The fire is almost entirely gone now, reduced to a heap of fine, white ash that hides the last few glowing embers. He takes the iron poker, a heavy, blackened rod with a hooked end, and stirs the remains. The sound is a soft, dry rasping, a friction of mineral against mineral. A few sparks rise, small and orange against the gray light, before winking out in the cold air. He decides not to restart the fire yet. The ritual of the morning patrol must come first. The transition from the interior to the exterior is a necessary shock, a way to reset the senses and re-establish his connection to the landscape he is sworn to watch. He begins the process of dressing for the patrol. It is a slow, methodical sequence of layers, each one adding to the weight on his shoulders. First, he checks the fastenings of his heavy wool trousers, the fabric so thick it feels like felted board. Then he pulls on a second sweater, a garment of coarse, unbleached wool that smells of sheep and wood smoke. Finally, he dons the greatcoat. It is a massive piece of tailoring, constructed from high-density wool and lined with quilted cotton. When he buttons it, he feels as though he is stepping into a portable room. The weight of the coat is significant, pressing down on his spine and forcing him to adopt a heavy, deliberate gait. In the drawing, his figure would now be a dense, textured mass, the charcoal and pastel strokes applied with a heavy hand to convey the sheer bulk of the clothing. He looks at his reflection in the small, silvered mirror above the washstand. His face is a map of shadows, his eyes recessed and dark, his skin the color of the gray light outside. He is the human embodiment of the Kolyma, hard, silent, and enduring. He picks up his hat, a heavy ushanka of thick, dark fur. He pulls the flaps down over his ears and ties them under his chin with a coarse cotton cord. The world becomes muffled, the sound of the wind outside reduced to a low, distant thrumming. He pulls on his mittens, which are made of two layers, an inner liner of knitted wool and an outer shell of toughened leather. He flexes his fingers, feeling the resistance of the materials. Every action in this environment is a struggle against the physics of the cold. To pick up a key, to turn a latch, to hold a pencil, each requires a conscious expenditure of energy, a calculated movement of the muscles against the encroaching stiffness. He picks up his flashlight, a heavy cylindrical tool made of stamped steel, and a small, leather-bound notebook. These are the instruments of his patrol, the tools he uses to record the state of the road and the integrity of the station. He moves to the door. The iron bar is cold, even through the leather of his mittens. He lifts it, the sound a resonant, heavy clank that seems to echo in the hollow spaces of the building. He opens the door and steps out onto the porch. The air is even colder than it was at 4 in the morning. It is a temperature that has moved beyond the sensation of freezing and into the realm of the absolute. The air is so dry it feels like it is made of fine sand, scraping against the back of his throat with every breath. He stands on the porch for a minute, letting his body adjust to the pressure. The landscape is revealed in the flat, gray light of the dawn. The mountains are silhouettes of slate and charcoal, their peaks lost in a low-hanging ceiling of cloud. The trees are motionless, their branches encrusted with a thick white rime that makes them look like delicate sculptures of bone. The road of bones is a pale, winding ribbon that disappears into the gloom, a silent witness to the history of the region. The history of the Kolyma is written in the logistics of the ZIS trucks and the GAZ pickups that once frequented this route. He thinks of the specific engineering challenges of the 1930s, the ZIS-5 trucks, which had to be modified for the extreme cold. The drivers would replace the standard oil with a mixture of diesel and lubricants that wouldn't solidify. They would insulate the fuel lines with rags and felt, and carry blowtorches to heat the engines during the long stops. The road was a gauntlet of mechanical failure. To drive the M56 was to enter into a contract with the machine and the environment, a contract where the penalty for failure was often terminal. The officer walks down the steps of the porch, his boots making a sharp, crunching sound in the frozen snow. The sound is high-pitched, a dry screet-screet that indicates the extreme low temperature. At -50, the snow loses its ability to compact. It behaves more like a mineral powder, a collection of tiny, jagged prisms that slide against each other. He begins his walk around the perimeter of the station. The visual scene is a masterclass in grayscale depth. The ground is a field of pale, dusty white, the shadows of the drifts rendered in soft, blurred strokes of indigo and charcoal. There are no sharp lines in nature at this hour, only gradients of value. He shines his flashlight toward the road. The beam of light is a solid, white cylinder, illuminating the millions of tiny ice crystals that hang suspended in the air. These crystals, known as diamond dust, are a common occurrence in the deep cold. They are not falling, they are simply there, a crystalline atmosphere that refracts the light and creates a faint, shimmering halo around the beam. He looks for any signs of movement, any tracks that might indicate the passage of a vehicle or an animal. There is nothing. The road is as empty as the sky. He thinks about the bridge again, the one at the 210-kilometer mark. He knows that soon he will have to take the small, hand-cranked Drasen out to inspect it. The Drasen is a primitive vehicle, a platform of wood and iron that sits on the narrow-gauge rails used for maintenance. To operate it is a task of pure, repetitive labor. He must stand and pump the long iron handle, a rhythmic, vertical motion that translates his own physical energy into a slow, grinding forward momentum. In this cold, the grease in the axles is like tar, and every stroke of the handle is a battle against the resistance of the machine. The journey to the bridge and back will take 4 hours, a 4-hour immersion in the absolute silence of the taiga. He will be a small, dark figure moving across a landscape of infinite white, a speck of dust on the skin of the world. He reaches the edge of the station's clearing, where the stunted larches begin. The trees are silent, but they are not still. They are under immense tension from the cold. Occasionally, he hears a sharp, sudden crack, the sound of the wood splitting under the internal pressure of the expanding ice. It is a sound like a pistol shot, a violent rupture of the silence that makes his heart skip a beat. He stops and listens, the sound of his own breathing loud in the muffled world of his Ushanka. The crack is not followed by anything else. The forest returns to its state of frozen stasis. He turns and looks back at the outpost. It is a small, dark box of timber, a fragile refuge in the middle of the wilderness. The gray light of the dawn is catching the edges of the roof, illuminating the thick, white quilt of snow that sits upon it. It looks like a drawing from an old book, a study in texture and isolation. The history of the M56 is also a history of the kilometers. Every 1,000 meters is marked by a post, and every post is a record of distance from the coast. He thinks of the 48th kilometer, the one he is responsible for. It is a stretch of road that includes a long, steady grade and a sharp curve around a rocky outcrop. He knows every stone on this stretch, every dip in the embankment, every place where the wind likes to pile the snow into impassable drifts. His duty is to ensure that this 1 kilometer remains a part of the whole, a functional link in the chain that connects Magadan to the interior. It is a small responsibility in the grand scale of the world, but in the Kolyma, the small things are the only things that matter. To fail in the maintenance of 1 kilometer is to threaten the integrity of the entire system. The visual scene is now reaching a point of maximum gray. The indigo of the night has been completely replaced by the slate of the morning. The textures are rich, the rough bark of the trees, the grainy surface of the snow, the heavy weave of his coat. Everything is rendered with a soft, blurred touch, as if seen through a lens of ice. The officer feels the cold beginning to penetrate the outer layers of his clothing, a slow, creeping chill that seeks out the gaps in his armor. He knows it is time to return to the interior, to the warmth of the stove and the routine of the logbook. He makes one final sweep with his flashlight, the beam cutting a pale path through the diamond dust, before turning back toward the outpost. He walks slowly, his movements synchronized with the rhythm of the wind. He is a man of the Kolyma, a man who has learned to inhabit the silence and the cold. He is not a hero of the road. He is its clerk, its witness, its guardian. He climbs the steps of the porch, his boots making the same sharp, crunching sound. He enters the outpost and bars the door, the sound of the iron hitting the wood a final, definitive statement. The night is over, the dawn has arrived, and the road remains. He takes off his mittens and picks up the pencil. He opens the logbook to the next line. 0800, morning patrol complete, visibility limited, temperature -54, no traffic. The words are a record of the endurance of the mundane. He sits in his chair and waits for the next hour to pass. The transition from the absolute darkness of the night to the pale, sterile gray of the morning has completed itself. Yet the room feels no more welcoming. The light that now occupies the space is a flat, shadowless illumination that seems to drain the color from everything it touches. In the visual style of the soft pastel drawing, the deep, resonant indigos of the previous hours have been overlaid with a heavy, opaque layer of slate and ash gray. The texture of the paper is very visible now, the charcoal grit catching the lighter pigments to create a mottled, ancient appearance. The officer stands by the stove, his silhouette no longer a mystery of shadow, but a clear, heavy outline of dark wool against the gray-timbered walls. He begins the slow process of shedding his outer layers. Each button of the greatcoat is a task. His fingers, though no longer frozen, are stiff and clumsy. The sound of the heavy coat sliding off his shoulders and landing on the wooden bench is a dull, muffled thud. The sound of a weight being removed, but not a burden. He hangs the coat on a heavy iron peg, where it looks like a slumped, lifeless version of himself, a woolen sentinel waiting for the next call to duty. He turns his attention back to the stove. The interior of the iron cylinder is a graveyard of gray ash, with the faint, spectral scent of burnt resin still lingering in the air. He must clear it. He takes a small metal shovel, its handle polished smooth by years of friction, and begins to scoop the ash into a bucket. The sound is a soft, dry hiss, a rhythmic shhhshhh that is the only melody in the room. The ash is as fine as flour, a gray powder that rises in a tiny, silent cloud and settles on the backs of his hands. To the officer, this ash is the residue of time, the physical remainder of the hours he spent watching the road. He thinks about the fuel logistics of the Kolyma, the immense effort required to bring wood and coal to these isolated stations. The larch logs he burns are a product of the local taiga, but the coal, the dense black stones that provide the core of the heat, must be hauled hundreds of kilometers from the mines of Arkagala. The history of the road is a history of fuel consumption. Every truck that moves, every station that stays warm, is a node in a vast, shivering network of energy distribution. He thinks about the oil of the North. In the 1940s and 50s, the chemists of the Dalstray worked tirelessly to develop lubricants that would not solidify in the Siberian winter. They created Arctic-grade diesel, a thin, pungent fluid that remained liquid even when the mercury retreated into the bulb. Without this specialized chemistry, the Kolyma would have been impassable for 10 months of the year. The road is a testament to the endurance of machines as much as men. He recalls the technical manuals for the ZIS-5 trucks, vehicles with wooden cabs and iron hearts. The manuals were printed on thin, gray paper, and they contained diagrams of the engine block that looked like anatomical drawings. To maintain a truck in this environment was to be a surgeon of metal. You had to know where to apply the heat, where to pack the grease, and how to listen for the subtle change in the engine's tone that signaled a pending failure. The officer is a surgeon of the station, maintaining the delicate balance of heat and light that allows human consciousness to persist in a place of absolute zero. He places fresh kindling into the stove, shavings of dry larch that curl like the hair of a ghost. He strikes a long wooden match against the iron. The sound is a sharp, sudden scrit, the first truly energetic sound of the day. The flame is a tiny, flickering point of orange and yellow, a violent contrast to the monochromatic gray of the room. In the pastel drawing, this would be a single, vivid stroke of cadmium orange, a focal point in a sea of slate. He watches the fire catch, the thin shavings blackening and then bursting into a soft, crackling heat. He adds larger logs, one by one, feeling the weight and the texture of the bark. The wood is cold, but the flame is hungry. Soon, the stove begins to radiate a dry, dusty warmth that pushes back against the encroaching chill of the morning. He sits in his chair, leaning toward the iron, his face illuminated by the flickering light through the grate. The visual scene outside the window has stabilized into a white sun reality. The sun is a pale, indistinct disk, visible through a thick haze of ice crystals. It offers no shadow and no warmth. It is merely a slightly brighter patch in a leaden sky. The drawing would show the landscape as a series of soft, rolling mounds of gray-white, with the dark spikes of the larch trees providing a rhythmic, vertical counterpoint to the horizontal lines of the drifts. There is a sense of immense, airless space. The silence of the morning is different from the silence of the night. It is not heavy and velvet, but thin and brittle, like a sheet of ice that might shatter if a sound were too loud. The officer watches the road through his small circle of cleared glass. The M56 is a pale gray ribbon, barely distinguishable from the surrounding snow. It is a road that leads to the end of the world, a path carved through the bones of the earth and the memory of the men who built it. He picks up his pencil again. The graphite point has worn down during the night, and he takes a small pocket knife to sharpen it. The wood of the pencil peels away in fine, aromatic spirals, revealing the dark, matte core of the lead. The sound of the knife against the wood is a slow, methodical shuck, shuck, shuck. He is careful not to break the point. In this environment, every resource is finite, every tool is precious. He looks at the logbook, at the page for the new day. The entries will be the same as they were yesterday and the day before. 0900, stove restoked, visibility poor, no movement. The boredom of the entry is its strength. It signifies a lack of crisis, a maintenance of the status quo. In the Kolyma, a boring day is a successful day. It means the road is still there, the station is still standing, and the officer is still recording the silence. He thinks about the concept of the long watch. During the era of the camps, the guards on the perimeters of the mines would stand for 12 hours at a time, their world reduced to the few hundred meters of their patrol. The officer's life is an extension of that watch, though the wires and the towers are gone. He is guarding a road that carries the wealth of the north, the gold from the Indigirka, the coal from the Zyryanka. He thinks of the administrative office in Magadan, where the reports he writes will eventually be filed in heavy, cardboard folders and placed on shelves in a room heated by steam pipes. Those clerks will never know the smell of the larch smoke or the sound of the wind through the eaves of Station 48. They deal in the abstractions of the road, the tonnage, the quotas, the logistics. He deals in the reality of the road, the ice, the gravel, and the weight of the sky. He feels a slight vibration in the floorboards. It is so faint that he at first thinks it is the wind, but it is too rhythmic, too low frequency. He stands and moves to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Far down the highway to the south, a shape is emerging from the gray haze. It is a truck. It moves with a glacial slowness, its headlights too pale, watery eyes in the gloom. It is a Ural 4320, a heavy, six-wheeled beast of a machine, its engine a low-frequency thrum that vibrates in the officer's chest long before he can hear the actual sound of the tires on the gravel. The truck is covered in a thick layer of rime ice, making it look like a prehistoric creature that has crawled out of a glacier. It is moving at no more than 20 kilometers an hour, its driver navigating the treacherous surface with a caution born of years of experience. The officer watches the truck as it passes the station. He does not wave and the driver does not signal. They are both part of the same silent machinery. The truck carries a heavy load, its chassis groaning under the weight of something covered by a thick, frozen tarpaulin. Perhaps it is machinery for the mines, or crates of supplies for a settlement further north. As it passes, the sound of the diesel engine fills the room, a rhythmic, mechanical growl that drowns out the ticking of the clock. It is a reminder of the industrial world, a brief intrusion of noise into the sanctuary of the silence. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the truck fades back into the gray haze of the distance. The sound recedes, the vibration in the floorboard stops, and the silence returns, heavier than before. The visual scene of the drawing would capture this moment with a sense of motion blur, the truck rendered in dark, heavy strokes, its headlights a soft smudge of pale yellow, while the surrounding landscape remains static and detailed. The officer returns to his desk and makes a new entry in the logbook. 10:15. One heavy vehicle south to north. Load unidentified. No assistance required. He sets the pencil down and feels a strange sense of satisfaction. The road has been used. The purpose of his presence has been validated. He is not just watching the void. He is watching the flow of history, however slow and intermittent it may be. The heat from the stove is now reaching its peak. The iron is humming, a low-frequency vibration that matches the rhythm of his own breathing. He feels the warmth on his skin, a dry, comforting pressure that makes his eyelids heavy. The boredom of the morning is a hypnotic force, a siren song of rest and inactivity. He resists it, not because he has work to do, but because the ritual of the watch requires his consciousness. He thinks about the Road of Bones moniker. In the local lore, it is said that for every meter of road, a life was lost during the construction. Whether or not the math is accurate, the weight of that history is felt in every stone. The road is a graveyard that people drive over, a monument that is used and worn down and repaired. It is a place where the past and the present are compressed into a single, frozen layer. He thinks of the bridge again, the one at the 210-kilometer mark. The passage of the heavy Ural truck will have put new stress on the frozen timbers. He will have to check the alignment of the beams when he makes his trip on the Draysine. Every vehicle that passes is a challenge to the integrity of the road, a test of the engineering and the maintenance. He is the judge of that test. He looks at his hands, the gray ash still visible in the fine lines of his skin. He is a man of the earth, a man of the road. His life is a series of slow, repetitive movements, melting snow, clearing ash, writing reports, watching the horizon. It is a life of profound insignificance in the eyes of the world, but in the Kolyma, it is the only thing that matters. The visual scene in the room is now reaching a point of maximum gray. The orange light of the stove fire is hidden behind the iron door, leaving only the flat, clinical light of the day to define the space. The textures are rich and tactile, the rough grain of the wood, the heavy weave of the wool, the smooth surface of the paper. Everything is rendered with a soft, blurred touch, as if seen through a veil of falling snow or a tired pair of eyes. The officer is a figure of infinite patience, a smudge of dark gray in a world of silver and slate. He closes his eyes for a moment, listening to the thrumming of the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. The day is long, the cold is absolute, and the duty is eternal. He is exactly where he is supposed to be. The light in the room has reached a state of pale, terminal exhaustion. It is mid-afternoon, a time when the sun, such as it is, has already begun its shallow, lateral retreat toward the serrated horizon of the mountains. In the visual language of the soft pastel drawing, the slate gray of the morning is being subtly infused with a thin, watery layer of lavender and cold zinc white. The textures of the room, the rough-hewn grain of the walls, the matte soot of the stovepipe, the heavy, oily surface of the desk, are rendered in exquisite, tedious detail. Every knot in the wood, every scratch in the iron, is a record of the outpost's resistance to the elements. The officer stands by the door, his figure once again encased in the massive, leaden architecture of his greatcoat. He is preparing for the inspection of the 210-kilometer bridge. It is a task that defines the intersection of human bureaucracy and geological indifference. To reach the bridge, he must use the Draysine, a primitive rail car that sits on the narrow-gauge maintenance track running parallel to a short section of the highway. He steps out onto the porch, and the cold is no longer a surprise. It is a familiar, heavy weight that he accepts without thought. The air is so still that the smoke from the stove rises in a perfectly vertical, translucent pillar of gray, a line drawn with a steady hand across the indigo sky. He walks toward the small, timber-framed shed where the Draysine is kept. The snow beneath his boots is so cold that it does not crunch. It squeaks, a high-pitched, abrasive sound like two pieces of polystyrene rubbing together. He reaches the shed and pulls back the heavy, iron-bound doors. Inside, the Draysine sits on its rails, a skeletal construction of cast iron and weathered larch planks. It is a machine of pure, unadorned function, its only moving parts being the heavy gears and the long, double-ended pump handle. The grease on the axles has turned into a solid, amber-colored wax, and the wood of the platform is silvered by decades of frost. He begins the process of moving the machine. Every movement is a study in resistance. He places his gloved hands on the wooden beam of the pump and pushes. At first, nothing happens. The machine is welded to the rails by a layer of microscopic rime ice. He leans his entire weight into the effort, his boots digging into the frozen earth. There is a sudden, sharp snap as the ice breaks, followed by a low-pitched metallic groan. The wheels turn an inch, then two. The sound is a rhythmic, grinding protest. Crrr-rack, screech, crrr-rack. In the silence of the Kolyma, these mechanical noises are amplified, echoing off the timber walls of the shed and vanishing into the vastness of the taiga. He pumps the handle again, a slow, vertical arc that requires a measured expenditure of his remaining strength. The draisen rolls out of the shed and onto the main track, its wheels clanging over the joints in the rails with a dull, hollow resonance. The history of these maintenance rails is a footnote in the larger narrative of the Road of Bones. They were laid during the expansion of the Dalstroy network to facilitate the transport of gravel and timber to the more vulnerable sections of the highway. The rails themselves are light, made of a low-grade steel that becomes dangerously brittle in the deep winter. The officer knows that a sudden impact could shatter a rail like a shard of glass, so he maintains a slow, rhythmic pace. He stands in the center of the platform, his body moving in a repetitive seesaw motion. Push, pull, wait, push, pull, wait. The rhythm is hypnotic, a physical mantra that clears the mind of all thought except for the maintenance of the cycle. The landscape begins to drift past at the speed of a slow walk. The visual outside is a masterpiece of environmental stillness. The taiga is a forest of ghosts, the larch trees encrusted with a layer of rime that is several inches thick. The branches look like heavy, white coral, frozen in a sea of gray air. The sky has deepened to a bruised violet, and the stars are beginning to re-emerge, hard and cold as diamonds. There is no horizon, only the gradual merging of the white ground into the dark sky. The drawing here would be rendered with a heavy hand, the dark pastel rubbed into the grain of the board to create a sense of infinite, airless depth. The only highlight is the pale, shimmering line of the rails as they catch the fading light of the sun. The officer is a dark, moving silhouette in the center of this void, a man of gray wool and iron, propelling himself through a world that has stopped breathing. He thinks about the mechanics of the draisen. It is a machine that demands a direct exchange of human energy for distance. There is no engine to roar, no fuel to burn, only the slow, rhythmic transformation of his own calories into forward momentum. It is a fair trade in the Kolyma. The history of the region is built on such exchanges. The caloric value of a bowl of thin gruel translated into a specific number of wheelbarrows of crushed rock. He feels the heat of the effort beneath his layers of wool, a small, internal pocket of warmth that is constantly being eroded by the sub-zero air pressing against his face. The air is so cold that his breath forms a solid crust of frost on the fur of his ushanka and the wool of his collar. He is becoming encrusted in his own exhalations, a living sculpture of ice. After an hour of rhythmic pumping, the bridge at the 210-kilometer mark emerges from the gloom. It is a massive timber trestle, a complex architecture of vertical posts and diagonal braces that spans a deep, rocky chasm. In the twilight, it looks like the skeleton of a great, prehistoric beast. The officer brings the Drayson to a slow, grinding halt a few meters from the bridgehead. He steps off the platform, and the silence that rushes back in is absolute. It is a silence that rings in the ears, a physical presence that seems to press against his chest. He takes his flashlight and begins the inspection. The beam of light is a sharp, white needle, cutting through the purple haze to illuminate the joints of the timber. The history of this bridge is a record of structural anxiety. Because it is built of wood and sits on permafrost, it is in a state of constant, slow-motion change. The ice in the ground heaves the foundation pilings, while the frost in the timbers expands the bolt holes. He looks for the telltale signs of failure, the widening of a gap, the splintering of a support beam, the accumulation of ice in a way that shifts the center of gravity. He walks across the deck, his boots making a hollow, booming sound that echoes in the depths of the chasm below. The river at the bottom is a solid, motionless snake of white ice, its voice stilled for the next 5 months. He leans over the railing, his breath creating a thick cloud that drifts slowly into the abyss. Everything is in its place. The bridge is holding. It is a monument to the endurance of larch and iron, a fragile link in the chain of the M56. He thinks about the bridge builders of the 1930s. They worked without heavy cranes or modern power tools. They used handsaws to cut the logs, hand drills to make the bolt holes, and sheer physical labor to hoist the beams into place. The history of the Kolyma is not written in grand designs, but in the stubborn, repetitive application of basic physics. They built it to last, but they also built it to be repaired. Every winter, a man like him comes to this spot, listens to the wood groan, and records the state of the structure. It is a duty of observation, a quiet guardianship that asks for no recognition. He completes his circuit of the bridge and returns to the Drayson. The cold has deepened during his time on the deck, and he can feel the frost beginning to numb his cheeks. The return journey is even slower. The track has a slight upward grade, and every stroke of the pump handle is a battle against gravity and the thickening grease in the axles. Push, pull, wait. The rhythm is slower now, more labored. He watches the stars as they move with glacial speed across the sky. The constellation of the Great Bear is high and clear, a silver map in the indigo dark. He thinks of the distance between those stars and the wooden platform he stands on. It is a distance that makes his life feel like a flicker of a match in a hurricane, insignificant, yet bright while it lasts. The Kolyma Highway is a line drawn in the dust of the world, a path that humans take through a landscape that does not know their names. The visual scene is now almost entirely monochromatic again. The lavender has faded into a deep, saturated blue, and the shadows of the taiga are as black as ink. The drawing would show the officer as a smudge of charcoal, his form merging with the dark platform of the Drayson. The only detail is the texture of the rime ice on the trees, catching the starlight and glowing with a faint, ghostly luminescence. It is a world of silver and shadow, a silent, frozen theater where the only actor is a man with a pump handle. He feels a sense of profound peace in the repetition. The effort has reached a state where it no longer feels like labor. It is simply the way he exists in this moment. The ticking of his internal clock has synchronized with the grinding of the gears. As he approaches the outpost, the small, warm glow of the stove light becomes visible through the trees. It is a tiny, amber spark in the middle of a cold, blue universe. It is the destination, the goal of his caloric exchange. He brings the Drayson to its final stop beside the shed, the wheels screeching one last time as they bite into the frozen rails. He is too tired to move the machine back inside the shed. It will stay on the track until the morning. He walks toward the outpost, his legs heavy and stiff, his movements like those of a clockwork doll whose spring has almost unwound. He climbs the steps of the porch, the wood creaking under his boots, a sound that is as welcoming as a voice. He enters the room and bars the door. The warmth of the stove, though fading, feels like a physical embrace. He sheds his mittens and his ushanka, the frost on the fur immediately beginning to melt and turn into tiny, glistening beads of water. He moves to the desk and picks up the pencil. His hand is shaking slightly from the exertion, but he manages to write the entry in a neat, steady script. 16:30. Bridge inspection at 210 km complete. No structural anomalies detected. Temperature falling. No traffic. He lays the pencil down and sits for a long time watching the light of the dying fire. The night is returning, the deepest dark of the 24-hour cycle. He has completed his task. He has watched the road, checked the bridge, and recorded the silence. He is a part of the history of the Kolyma, a single, quiet entry in the vast, frozen ledger of the North. The visual scene in the room is now a study in chiaroscuro. The single light of the stove door casts a long, orange glow across the floorboards, while the rest of the room is a mystery of deep, textured shadow. The officer is a figure of graphite and burnt sienna, a man defined by his endurance and his boredom. He closes his eyes and listens to the wind as it begins its evening song against the timber walls. The Kolyma is sleeping, and he is its guardian. The road is silent, the bridge is steady, and the night is eternal. He is exactly where he needs to be. The final hour of the watch arrives not with a fanfare of light, but with the deepest, most suffocating iteration of the dark. It is the time when the atmosphere seems to have reached its limit of compression, a weight of indigo and obsidian that presses against the timber walls of the outpost with a physical, tactile force. In the visual language of the soft pastel drawing, the dark surface of the board has been saturated with layers of the deepest Prussian blue and charcoal, leaving only the faintest, most ghost-like suggestions of form. The officer is back in his chair, a figure of absolute stillness, rendered in a series of heavy, vertical strokes that merge him with the shadows of the larchwood corner. The warm light of the stove is now a mere memory, a tiny, glowing pinprick of deep garnet red visible through the air intake of the iron door. It does not illuminate the room. It only serves as a focal point for the eye, a small, pulsing heart in a body of ice. The silence has become a resonant frequency, a low-pitched hum that vibrates in the officer's chest, synchronized with the slow, heavy rhythm of his own heartbeat. He looks at the logbook one last time. The pages are now almost entirely dark, the yellowed paper having absorbed the shadows of the room until it matches the tone of the wood. He thinks about the sheer volume of paper that this road has consumed over the decades. The history of the Kolyma is a history of the record. Every kilometer, every bridge, every truck, and every man has been entered into a ledger somewhere. A vast, bureaucratic archive that mirrors the physical structure of the highway. He thinks of the administrative headquarters in Magadan, a gray stone building where the air is filled with the dry, papery scent of 1,000,000 files. To the clerks in that building, the M56 is a series of statistics, a graph of productivity and fuel consumption. To the officer, the road is a living entity, a gargantuan creature made of gravel and bone that breathes through the wind and sleeps beneath the snow. The record he keeps is not for the clerks. It is an act of witness, a way of acknowledging the road's existence in a world that would otherwise forget it. The history of the Road of Bones is also the history of the gravel itself. He reflects on the geology of the Kolyma, the ancient, weathered mountains of the Chersky and Verkhansk ranges, whose stones have been ground down by eons of frost and ice. This gravel is the foundation of everything. In the construction era, the quality of the gravel determined the longevity of a section of the road. The river-run gravel, smooth and rounded by the water, was easier to move but less stable. The crushed gravel, jagged and sharp, locked together to create a surface as hard as concrete, but it was brutal on the tires of the ZIS-5 trucks. The officer remembers the stories of the quarry brigades, men who spent their days swinging heavy iron picks against the frozen hillsides, their movements slow and repetitive, their breath a constant cloud of white mist. They were the ones who provided the raw material for the road's spine. Every stone beneath the wheels of a truck is a piece of that effort, a fragment of history that has been compacted into the permafrost. The visual scene outside the window is now a study in absolute monochromatic depth. The moon has long since set, and the stars are obscured by a thin, high layer of ice haze. Through the small circle of glass, the landscape is a void of gray and blue, a world without edges or horizons. The drawing would capture this with a soft, blurred technique, the pastel pigments smudged together until the trees, the road, and the sky become a single, seamless gradient of cold. The textures are the only thing that remains: the rough, grainy surface of the snow, the hard, crystalline rime on the window frame, the heavy, matted wool of the officer's sleeve. He feels the weight of the wool against his skin, a heavy, familiar pressure that has become a second skin. He is no longer an individual. He is a component of the outpost, a part of the machinery of the Kolyma. He thinks about the silence of the motors. In the height of winter, the silence is the most dangerous thing on the road. A motor that stops is a life that is forfeit. He recalls the heaters that were once used in the depots, large iron braziers filled with glowing coals that were placed under the oil pans of the trucks during the long nights. The drivers would sleep in the cabs, their ears tuned even in sleep to the rhythmic thrumming of the engine. If the pitch changed, if the rhythm faltered, they were awake in an instant, their breath freezing on the inside of the glass as they checked the gauges. The road is a corridor of mechanical endurance, a path where the ghost of the internal combustion engine is the only protection against the absolute zero of the wilderness. The officer listens for a truck, but there is nothing. The Ural 4320 that passed earlier is now hundreds of kilometers to the north, its headlights cutting through a different valley, its driver watching a different stretch of the horizon. The sensation of the cold has reached its zenith. It is no longer a chill. It is a profound, humming stillness that has settled into the marrow of his bones. He feels as though his very blood has slowed, becoming as thick and viscous as the winter-grade oil in the depots. This is the sleep of the North, a state of suspended animation where the mind retreats into a small, warm inner chamber and the body becomes a part of the landscape. He looks at the clock on the shelf. The ticking is slower now, or perhaps his perception of time has shifted. Tick, tick, tick. Each second is a heavy, leaden event, a mile marker on the long, dark road toward the morning. The bureaucracy of the station requires one final entry to close the cycle of the watch. He picks up the pencil. The cedar shaft is cold and the graphite is a matte, dark gray. He moves the point to the paper, the sound of the friction a soft, dry whisper that is loud in the airless room. He writes slowly, his hand moving with the glacial deliberation of a man who is recording the end of the world. 0600. End of watch. Total silence on the M56. Temperature -56. The road is clear. The bridge is steady. The record is complete. He lays the pencil down in the groove of the desk, and the sound of the wood hitting the wood is a final, definitive period. He leans back in the chair, the heavy wool of his coat creaking softly as it settles. He is finished. The visual style of the drawing is now reaching its final, most evocative layer. The dark surface of the board is almost entirely covered in a thick, velvety application of charcoal and deep indigo pastel. The only light comes from the tiny, dying ember in the stove, a single dot of warm orange that serves as the anchor for the entire composition. The officer's face is a study in chiaroscuro, the shadows of his features deep and opaque, the highlights on his forehead and cheekbones a pale, ghostly gray. He looks like a figure from an ancient manuscript, a guardian of a forgotten frontier. The drawing is full screen, no borders, a total immersion in the atmosphere of the Kolyma. It is a world of texture and shadow, a world where the only reality is the cold and the duty. The wind begins its final movement of the night. It is no longer a moan or a whistle. It is a steady, resonant thrumming that seems to come from the very core of the earth. It vibrates through the logs, through the floorboards, and through the officer's boots. It is the voice of the permafrost, the sound of the geological history of the North. It speaks of the millions of years of ice, the shifting of the mountains, and the slow, agonizing formation of the gravel. The road, the M56, the Road of Bones, is merely a temporary interruption in this history, a thin line of human effort drawn over a landscape of eternal stasis. The officer listens to the wind and feels a sense of profound insignificance. He is a clerk of the ice, a witness to a process that will continue long after he and his outpost have been reclaimed by the taiga. He closes his eyes. The darkness behind his eyelids is identical to the darkness of the room. He is no longer watching the road, he is the road. He feels the weight of the gravel, the pressure of the frost, the silence of the 1,000 miles of wilderness that surround him. He is a part of the loop, a segment of the cycle that begins and ends in the cold. The Kolyma Highway is a ribbon of memory, a path carved through the bones of the earth, and he is its silent guardian. The night is over, yet the night is eternal. The cold is a constant, a presence that requires no acknowledgement. He breathes out, a long, slow sigh that disappears into the gloom, and the room returns to its state of absolute, heavy stillness. The drawing is now complete. The soft pastels have been blended into a final, monochromatic wash of deep, frozen space. The textures of the wood and the wool are the only things that remain, a tactile record of the endurance of the mundane. The officer is a smudge of charcoal on a dark board, a figure of graphite and shadow who has become one with the environment. The road of bones stretches out into the dark, a pale line in a world of indigo, waiting for the first light of a sun that will offer no warmth. The watch is ended, the record is closed, and the silence of the Kolyma remains, vast and unchanging. The clock on the shelf ticks one last time before the spring of the mechanism finally unwinds. Tick. And then there is nothing. The silence is total. The weight of the night is absolute. The officer remains in his chair, a statue of duty and ice, while the wind continues its long, mournful song against the logs of the house. The Kolyma does not move. The mountains do not breathe. The road remains, a silent witness to the passage of time in a place where time has no meaning.